Rhubarb. Welcome, listeners, to another episode of The History Blokes, the podcast that discusses interesting facts, figures, and stories from Australia's history that we think you ought to know. I'm Chris McComb.
I'm Conan.
And we're coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. Before we get into the episode, don't forget to follow us on our Instagram account. That's at History Blokes. And also leave any comments and suggestions. We'd love to hear from you.
Polite comments.
Indeed. We'd love to hear from you, both of you.
Yeah.
But this, of course, has been a big week, Conan. We were hoping, of course, to have actually recorded this on
Anzac Day
itself.
But due to slackness.
Yeah, that's right, due to my slackness, we didn't quite get there. So, episode 9, Conan, what's this one all about?
Well, you're never going to believe it, Chris. I'm not going to be talking about Gallipoli. I'm going to be talking about the history of Anzac Day and contrasting it to the history of Australia Day. So as you'll recall from a few episodes ago, Chris, the thing I suppose the thing I find interesting is that they are very different in the way that they've evolved. So Australia Day was very specific to Sydney. It took quite a long time before anyone there even started to think about it. Then it was called sort of Foundation Day or whatever. And then the other states were having their own Foundation Day. And there was lots of just toing and froing over when Australia Day would fall, what to call it, whether to make it a public holiday. It took basically 200 years.
And it kind of feels artificial and imposed.
Yes, it does a bit. Whereas Anzac Day, as we will discover, it didn't spring into existence fully formed, but pretty close. And we will find some strange facts about how that took place.
And I think a lot of people, in many ways, if I observe how Australians respond to both Australia Day and Anzac Day, I think Anzac Day seems to carry, it carries more meaning, and people engage in the day, kind of as a nation in a way that they don't, I think, with Australia Day.
Yes, it feels much more the national day, and of course it's less controversial, so that at least it's not sullied by that. There is a bit of controversy around it, in the sense that some people perceive it to be a celebration of war, but that seems to be increasingly taking a back seat because it is a mixture of solemnity and not exactly celebration, but recognition of Australia's distinct identity, whatever that means to particular people.
Indeed, and look, engagement in the day too. It's heartening to see so many people that are so far removed from that generation now sort of making a comeback. At one point, the crowd that attended the marches were diminishing, whereas I feel in the last little while, it's all bolstered again.
Yes, it's certainly charted its own course over the last 100 or so years, and we'll be talking a bit about that. I'm actually looking forward to your intermission because you'll be talking about the evacuation of Gallipoli. So if at any point people listening to me get bored of my jibber-jabber, just hang out for Chris, and he'll be drawing on his grandfather's experiences. He landed there on the 25th, didn't he, at Gallipoli?
He certainly did. My grandfather was an artilleryman, so he didn't go in with the first boats with everybody else storming the beaches, but he certainly went in on that day, a little later on, and set up his guns. And he was there for the whole campaign.
Yeah, Christ. Good, looking forward
to it. He was rewarded by being sent to the Somme.
Yeah, and no finer reward than that. So, Chris, as ever, the quiz. This one has a military theme. So this is question number 1. What's larger, a platoon or company?
I would say a company.
Very good. Indeed. Yeah, that's correct. So a platoon has about 30 to 60 soldiers. A company has about 100 to 200.
Spot on.
Yeah, very good. What does a DSO stand for? And what is it?
Officer. Something officer? Okay, I have no idea.
It's a decoration, as in a medal, and it stands for Distinguished Service Order.
Ah, of course. That does ring a bell.
Yeah. Question 3. A 2-star general is a major general. A 2-star admiral is a what?
You've got me.
A rear admiral. Yes, and the Air Force equivalent is an air vice marshal.
Okay. I did not know that.
No, there you are. I don't know why I know that. What was the Battle of the Bulge?
It might have... No, I'm thinking Market Garden, that thing.
It's a similar time.
Yeah, it was...
A similar place.
Yeah, okay.
So it's when it was the last great roll of the dice for the Germans.
Yep.
Late 1944, where Hitler just realised that unless this worked, it was all over. So it was a massive counter-offensive that the Germans launched against the Allies with a view to getting to Antwerp.
They couldn't sustain it, though, obviously.
No, one sort of cool feature of it was that they focused on a particularly weak area of the Allied front, and they infiltrated it with Germans who spoke fluent English, so with American accents, dressed in American uniforms.
Wow.
And they would infiltrate that way.
And it kind of worked.
It was pretty effective. Question 5, last one. Civil War General and US President Ulysses S. Grant. What did the S stand for?
I think that stood for Sylvester. I'm making that up.
It stood for nothing. So there you are. Okay. So Anzac Day, as we all know, is a result of when 16,000 soldiers in the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps landed on what is now called Anzac Cove on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April 1915. Around 2,000 of them were killed or wounded on that day. So this is really about how that moment was converted almost instantly into a myth, rendered in our consciousness as a myth, even though it was essentially factual.
Indeed, the day that forged Australia's reputation. At least that's the story, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's partly a result of a British war correspondent called Ellis Ashmead Bartlett. So 2 weeks after the Gallipoli landing, various Australian papers published a flattering account that he had written. And many Australians then and now saw the landing and the Australians' deeds at Gallipoli as a sort of rite of passage, as you just said.
And I should say, I'm going to repeat my little comment before, forged Australia and New Zealand's reputation.
Yes, let's not forget the Kiwis.
Mm.
Yeah, so, I mean, Australia had only become not exactly independent of Britain, but it had federated only 14 years before. So this was our first trial by fire, I guess. Because, of course, Australians had served in the Boer War and in colonial conflicts before that, but they had done so as Brits. And it was also, of course, this view of Gallipoli was fostered by C.E.W. Bean, Charles Bean, the official historian, who, of course, went on to co-found the Australian War Memorial and wrote the official history of the First World War from the Australian perspective. Here's a question for you, Chris. So given that the Anzac landings were very clearly entrenched in the national consciousness so quickly, when do you think the first Anzac Day was?
If I recall, I think it happened very quickly. Literally within 12 or 24 months, like 1 year or 2 years after, certainly before the end of the war.
Wrong.
Really?
Yes. It was less than a year. What?
Doesn't make any damn sense. Well, they're celebrating the 6-month anniversary. Doesn't make any sense.
This is what happened. In the opening year of the First World War, various organisations formed in Australia to raise funds for Australian troops. In mid-1915, many of them went from merely seeking donations to organising fundraising days that combined patriotic displays with carnivals and so forth. Now, in mid-1915, the South Australian government decided to turn the upcoming Labour Day, which was the 13th of October, into a fundraising day, and Labour Day was a public holiday, and the organisers decided that it should be called Anzac Day as a way of raising money.
Is that right? The South Australians have done it again. They've gone first.
They've gone first.
Incredible.
And so what's that? 6 months.
Jeepers creepers.
Not many people know that.
I certainly didn't.
And you're right, in 1916 it was a proper celebration. So by the end of December 1915, all Allied forces had been evacuated, as we will soon learn from you. It was clear that the campaign had been a total failure. More than 8,700 Australians had been killed, as had 2,800 or so New Zealanders, and tens of thousands of British and French. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people forget that Australia and New Zealand were actually a relatively small contingent there compared to the Brits and the others.
And we should also say that a great many more Turks died defending their homeland.
It was almost twice as many, actually. Really? But, it speaks to the tactics of the time and also the energy in which people threw themselves into battle to protect their homeland.
Yeah. So in Europe, the war was showing no sign of coming to an end, and many of those who had survived Gallipoli would soon be sent to the Western Front, as your grandfather unfortunately discovered. Most Australians, however, still felt that the Gallipoli landing had been an event of huge significance and that it had to be marked in some way. So this is a quote from the Queensland Minister for Education back in April 1916. He said, "State schools should commemorate Anzac Day by suitable addresses to their pupils, dwelling upon the gallant landing of Australian and New Zealand troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula, their splendid achievements, their sacrifices and their loyal devotion to duty, our grief at the great loss they suffered, and our country's debt of gratitude to them and theirs." I think that's quite well put.
Certainly is.
So the federal government, they recognise its symbolic importance, And they hoped that commemorating the campaign might improve enlistment numbers, which were beginning to dwindle by this point.
I see the motivation for making a big deal of it early, even while the very troops were out fighting in a different theatre by then.
Yeah. So in 1916, the acting Prime Minister, Minister for Defence, George Pearce, officially named 25th of April Anzac Day, though it wasn't yet a public holiday. So, yeah, within a year, it was officially a national day, right? And all states marked the occasion with a commemorative service, after which new enlistees and Gallipoli veterans marched down the streets of their town or city. And in many towns, a lunch was provided for veterans. And, there were festivities going on into the evening.
And that was all across Australia, towns, cities, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, very much. And so this is how the Sydney Morning Herald put it on Anzac Day 1916. Australia's great heart is throbbing today as it has never throbbed before. For April 25, Anzac Day is a day that will live in our hearts and in our history as long as Australia lasts.
Once again, very dramatic.
Stirring stuff. However, in Queensland, Anzac Day 1916 was organised by the influential Anzac Day Commemoration Committee, which ensured the day revolved entirely around commemoration. So this becomes a sort of recurring theme, the distinction between celebration and commemoration. So the committee forbade fundraising as that involved a festive element, and they felt that was inappropriate.
They're taking it seriously.
Oh, very seriously.
They're taking it very seriously.
So it was kind of like Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
They were treating it in those terms.
It makes sense.
Understandable.
Yeah.
And so this solely commemorative approach to Anzac Day would be retained in Queensland for the next 50 years. So they really had a very different perspective to the rest of the country.
Everyone else is standing around playing two-up, and meanwhile the Queenslanders are attending a service.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You'd sort of think in some ways it would be the other way around. But, Victorian organisers took a different view, and they focused on fundraising through pageantry and celebration in the afternoon. New South Wales, opinion was divided. So, for example, the Lord Mayor of Sydney was criticised by the families of the dead for spending £1,000, obviously a lot of money, on decorative lighting for public buildings. And returned servicemen, on the other hand, urged the state government to make it festive, as they felt that is what their fallen comrades would have wanted.
I think that's a fair call too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's true. And in London that year, around 2,000 sombre Anzacs marched through the streets, cheered on by enthusiastic Britain. And after the march, they then went to a commemorative service at Westminster Abbey. So troops stationed in Egypt, so they held services for their fallen comrades. John Monash, who was then a brigadier. So he explained in a letter to his wife that after the service in Egypt, the morning was spent playing cricket and other games, and in the afternoon the troops took part in a great aquatic carnival. I don't know what that means.
An aquatic carnival?
I assume,
beach volleyball?
I assume makeshift boats of some kind. And
they did this in Egypt?
Yeah.
I picture one of those boat races like they have in the dry riverbeds in Alice Springs and Birdsville or something like that.
They got the Nile. So you heard of the Nile. Followed by, this is funny, by a skit about the landing.
Skits about the landing. You know what? Now that's Australian.
Yeah, that's
Australian. Absolutely and Australian.
I wish that was captured on film.
Would have loved to have seen that.
It could have been lame, but equally it could have been very funny. And it's very Australian that they would do it. So, interesting. So, the point is very much celebrated. But, as we will discover after the intermission, so you're already very much seeing an Anzac Day that we recognise, but it still has not been formalised as the Anzac Day that we have now. But, Chris, I'm excited to hear what you have to tell us.
All right, Conan. Well, I'm going to talk to you not so much about the Gallipoli action. I think most Australians have a pretty good idea in terms of, the Anzac campaign. But why were they there? Well, they're kind of there upon request of the Russians. And the Russians were getting a hard time, of course, by the Turks, and they put out a call to the Brits going, guys, can you relieve us a little bit here or distract the Turks in some way? And of course, the Brits, with their mighty naval power, of course, thought, well, that's fine. We've got a whole lot of ships. We're just going to pound them, from the Dardanelles Straits.
Yeah, well, they want to get through the Dardanelles.
They did want to get
into Sea of Marmara and onto Istanbul, didn't they?
They did indeed. That's right. They wanted to take Constantinople by sea.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they wanted to do. And anyway, so look, it just didn't work, ultimately. So they went to a plan B. In many ways, the plan B was the folly, ultimately, that ended up being the Gallipoli campaign.
My understanding is that the issue for the Navy was that there were forts along the Dardanelles which were pounding the crap out of the Navy. They sunk like 4 battleships or something. The Brits did try to take the Dardanelles or go through them, but this got smashed.
It was just too fortified, and they couldn't get their ships through. That makes complete sense.
So the Anzac, I think the plan for the Anzacs was to come from Anzac Cove. It's just fresh in my mind because I got intoxicated the other day. Intoxicated by the Gallipoli, I should say, and I was reading up on it. And so Anzac Cove, where the Anzacs landed, is on the other side of the peninsula to where the forts are, on the other side of the Dardanelles. So the idea was that they would land there, go overland to the forts, take them from behind by land, and knock them out, and therefore the Navy could get through the Dardanelles. And the army would consolidate the peninsula.
That's exactly right. And, whilst it was a bit of maybe a good scheme on paper, clearly it didn't work tactically or strategically. And, of course, some people know, but not everyone knows, that Churchill was one of the main orchestrators of the entire campaign. And he was ultimately demoted and he resigned from government.
Yes, he was First Lord of the Admiralty. So that's basically a fancy way of saying Minister of the Navy. In fairness to him, I'm not sure it would have been successful. I think the idea was they pound Constantinople, and the hope was that the Turkish government would capitulate. I don't know if that was realistic, and I've heard it suggested that that wasn't. That was just a fantasy. But from a tactical point of view, it was reasonably sound. But what they didn't realise was that Kemal Ataturk was going to be on the scene. And he was later, of course, the first president of Turkey. But the thing is, he was a lieutenant colonel who was pretty much first on the scene after the Anzacs landed, and he rallied the troops. So he he basically said, you will not let these guys take the peninsula. You will stay to the last man and the last bullet. I think there's a quote that's often used, your job is not to fight, your job is to die. To buy us time for more troops to come up behind and stop these Australians or whatever, these Brits from taking the peninsula.
Well, he certainly proved that. 87,000 Turks died during the campaign versus 44,000 of the Allied forces.
Wow.
Kemal Ataturk, of course, cut his teeth there, and ultimately he was really the founding father of modern Turkey.
Yeah, that's right. They're a very impressive individual. So it was just in many ways unlucky that the Anzacs came up against him.
Indeed.
And it's not him single-handedly. Of course, the Turks were determined fighters.
Absolutely. Well, we were attacking their homeland.
Yeah. They were wildly underestimated by the Brits.
Indeed.
They assumed that they would just flee. But not so.
So anyway, as you know, the campaign went on for must be 9 months, up until December. And the decision to evacuate arose from a visit by Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. He was the Secretary for State of War at the time. And in mid-November 1915, he just popped along for a couple of hours, had a bit of a look at Anzac Cove, had a bit of a look at, the Turkish line, and said, this isn't going to work. I'm going to make a recommendation to the War Cabinet that we get everyone out of here. There was a big offensive back in August where they had a big push to try to take the Turkish positions and make some ground. It didn't work, and they simply just didn't have it in them, or the reserves in them, I should say, to have another crack. And I should say, Conan, I've been to Gallipoli, I've been to the battlefield, and what really struck me, well, perhaps two things. One was the terrain. It is incredibly rugged, but also incredibly beautiful, to be quite frank. An amazing location. And the second thing that really struck me is just how small the battlefield was. For example, in the movie Gallipoli, the one with Mel Gibson, where they do that big run at the end where they charge the Turkish lines. So that was the Battle of the Neck. And I've been to the Neck, and it's like 30 metres between the trenches. Really? So you imagine coming out of your trench and then just charging in a machine gun 30 metres away. I mean, my goodness, the slaughter that was occurring at close range was just horrific.
So I think it's one of the best war movies ever made, really. Well, particularly that last scene.
Yeah. And ahead of its time, while war movies were still coming out of that glorious approach to battle and heroism in war to something that was getting a little bit more real.
Yeah, and he was well cast, wasn't he? Because there was sort of like they were both young, and Mark Lee, who was the actor playing the guy who was killed in that final scene, was kind of feminine, wasn't he? So there was kind of like it felt more like a lamb to the slaughter, I suppose, in a way, than if it had been. I don't know, someone...
I agree. He wasn't like
a
6.5 foot muscle-bound, stubbled hero that single-handedly was going to take on the Turkish trenches. So anyway, the Brits did what they did best, and they kind of sat on it for a while. The British War Cabinet sat on it for a few weeks before they decided to finally end the campaign. But of course, the commander of the expeditionary force, Sir Charles Munro, had pretty much already started making plans to evacuate. But the big question, of course, is how can they sneak away? You know, everyone trying to evacuate Anzac Cove and off the beach and across the peninsula whilst the machine guns are just rattling away. That's just a horrible, horrible thought. It all came down to an Australian staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Brudnell White, and he had a cunning plan to gradually withdraw the men and their gear while convincing the Turks that everything was basically all okay, you know, fighting as per normal.
Because a retreat is a very dangerous operation.
Absolutely.
In a military context. You're obviously very vulnerable. So
Absolutely, and the rattling of those machine guns while you're trying to get out to your boats, I mean, it'd be worse than the landing, because this time the Turks would be prepared, in place, and firing away.
And they would open up with the artillery and send in the infantry. As you're scuttling down the slopes, getting into boats, rowing madly.
So anyway, the British War Cabinet did make the decision on the 8th of December to get out. So as part of the Lieutenant Colonel's plan, it was really a process of deception. For a period, they ceased fire, which would be kind of normal in preparing for the winter months as they kind of dig in and do other sorts of things. And at the end of that period, they began irregular fire on the Turkish positions. And artillery fire, of course, was very much part of that. And I should say my grandfather, of course, would have been actually part of this manoeuvre. I'm very proud of that fact, for sure. And so anyway, continuing the sporadic fire and keeping the Turks thinking the Australians are still there, still firing, and still carrying out their operations as per normal.
And they were getting sort of used to the idea of lulls between barrages, weren't they?
That's exactly right. That's exactly
quite long,
right. So,
longer than usual lags between each barrage.
Indeed. Getting them used to a different cadence of battle, effectively. Exactly. So, during the nights, of course, they would move equipment off, but during the day, they would bring equipment back, non-essential equipment and other types of equipment, in order to give the Turks the impression that it was basically business as usual. There were sort of 3 stages in terms of the evacuation of the Allies.
Did it have a cool name, like Operation Tortoise?
No, but probably should.
Yeah. It's a missed opportunity, because I don't think they were into that in the First World War as much as they were in the... I think
the Second World War was all about code names. The entire war was a series of...
that gave away exactly what the plan was, wherever possible.
Operation Mama Bear.
Operation Retreat from the...
Overlord, though. Come on, Overlord was brilliant.
That's
D-Day.
D-Day, yeah. Do you know what the deception operation was called?
No, hit me with that.
That was Fortitude, Operation Fortitude. Probably at least as interesting as Operation Overlord, because, of course, they were terrified that the Germans would work out they're going to land at Normandy. So they had to try to convince them that they were going to land at Calais.
Indeed.
So they went to the most elaborate lengths to convince the Germans of that.
If only this wasn't a podcast of Australian history. So anyway, and they continued to trickle men and equipment out to make it look like they were preparing for winter, just having the minimum number of men to hold things whilst the conditions were no good for fighting. And so stage 2 was basically where they dropped the number of troops in the Anzac garrison from 41,000 to 26,000. And I really love this bit. The final stage, on the 17th of December, just a couple of days before they evacuated, they actually held a cricket match. A famous cricket match at a place called Shell Green. And they played this while the Turkish were firing, overhead. And then on the 18th of December, at the end of the second stage, there were about 20,000 soldiers left at Anzac. And then they withdrew the remainder of them over the next couple of days. And by the 20th of December, 1915, they were gone.
Yeah, and I think a crucial part of it was that the frontline troops, it wasn't that they removed the troops in the frontline trenches and then removed the guys behind them and so forth, because they knew that the Turks would, if they got even a hint that was happening. So they thinned out the troops from the front line, but they kept a sort of minimum number to continue to fire guns, to keep the action going and to make noise and stuff.
Indeed.
And then on the night of the evacuation, whatever it was, 3 a.m., all of these guys had to be extracted very quietly. And of course, I mean, I assume that by that point, they would have known, the troops, because this was kept very secret from the troops themselves until the absolute last possible minute. So these troops who were basically...
given they're 30 metres from the Turkish trenches, you can kind of see why.
Yeah, that's right. And you can... they would have been pretty scared, because you know what military communication is like, particularly back then. You've got to hope that they weren't going to be forgotten, that all the boats are going to go.
They stayed on the peninsula, had families and grandchildren with the locals, became peasant farmers.
That's right. Yeah, might have worked out well for them. But probably it wouldn't have. Yeah, they would have just been stormed and all slaughtered or captured by the Turks.
What I really like is some of the ingenuity that was applied to, of course, evacuation. Many of our listeners, of course, have heard of some of the mechanisms that were put in place to convince the Turks that people were still around. Have you heard of the drip or pop-off rifle, Conan?
Yes.
I think everyone has.
Iconic. It's an iconic device.
It really is. And that was developed by Lance Corporal William Charles Scurry. And he developed a device where there would be two pots. One full of water, one that water would run to or drip into. And when the bottom pot was full, it would pull on a lever, which would then pull on the trigger and automatically, of course, fire the rifle.
Yeah.
So they set these up all over, the Anzac area, the Anzac landing area. And just as they're on their way out, they would punch a very small hole in the top water-filled container and then allow the guns to do the thing. I think that's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, it's pretty brilliant. It's a great idea, and I can only assume that we didn't take a patent out on it and it was nicked by the Americans.
The Americans still use it today. They made a fortune. But
Aussie ingenuity at its best.
You betcha. But look, it is an incredible story. There was victory in the retreat. There's absolutely no doubt. Like, nobody was killed, I believe, in the retreat.
Yeah,
but I don't know if anyone was injured. But anyway, nobody was
one
killed.
Injury, but
and maybe
literally one, and it wasn't major. I think.
Given they're evacuating 40,000 people, that is incredible. That's an amazing story.
Achievement. Yeah. So what happened to your grandfather?
Well, he went on to fight on the Western Front. In fact, I've got his war diaries, which is really interesting. As an artilleryman, it's primarily about the weather and wind direction. Yeah. But look, it is still amazing piece of family history.
Yeah,
so he went forward in the Somme. He was gassed once, went back to Old Blighty, then went back into the battle, went back to the front, was shelled and he got shrapnel wound. He went back to Old Blighty and then back to the front again. But he survived. Clearly, he survived the war and made it back to Australia. Thank heavens for that.
Quite.
I thank him for that.
Yes. But this podcast will not be the same. Yeah.
Well, and that's the intermission, Conan.
Yeah, and I would have had to do it myself.
Which would be a struggle for everybody involved.
It would have been a struggle. Chris, thank you. That was really interesting. Fantastic.
Thanks, Conan.
Okay, and right, Anzac Day has been observed every year since 1916. In 1927, for the first time, every state observed some form of formal public holiday on Anzac Day. So that's pretty quick. So obviously just 12 years after the fact, given how long it took. Like, it was only in the 1990s. Is that what I was saying in the Australia Day?
80s? Oh, 90s? No, it was the 90s by the time we had uniform.
Yes, uniform public holidays on that day.
We should know this. We should know. The whole episode about it. We need to listen to our own podcast.
I refuse to listen to. So there's obviously an enormous public appetite for Anzac Day that Australia Day didn't enjoy. Although there were tensions between the premiers over precisely, as I said before, how much solemnity should be involved, right? So by the mid-30s, all the rituals we now associate with the day, and particularly the dawn vigil, the marches, the 2-minute silence, the memorial services, the wreath-laying ceremonies, the reunions, the soldiers' lunches, all of this had been firmly established as part of Anzac Day culture. So if you consider really that Australia Day is simply
fireworks,
but that's it, right?
There's no ceremony as such,
no.
outside of Australia medals and things like that.
Yeah, the Australian of the Year, that kind of stuff, fireworks, as you say. But really, there's no ceremony. So I'm not saying there should be. But what is...
There once was a ceremony.
Was it?
Yeah. Do you remember the mock landings and so on?
Oh, yes. And if you don't know what we're talking about, listeners, listen to the Australia Day episode. Just mad. Now, these rituals come down to one person, which generally isn't widely known. They were devised and disseminated around Australia by a man called Canon David Garland. He was a military chaplain. Now, we mentioned before Queensland's Anzac Day Commemoration Committee and how they pushed for a more solemn way of approaching Anzac Day. So he was secretary of that. Even though he was an Anglican, he sought to make the services ecumenical, so they were accessible to all Australians, no matter what your faith. And he was described at the time as the life and soul of Anzac Day. Right? And according to the Australian Dictionary of Biography, he was, quote, overpoweringly energetic, with a distinctive flair, if not genius, for organisation.
Fantastic. Maybe he should have been running the campaign.
Yes, yes, maybe he should have. Overpoweringly energetic sounds like a bit of a backhanded compliment, doesn't it?
I completely agree. It does sound like a bit of a slap, doesn't it?
Yeah. It sounds like you wouldn't want to go up against him. When he obviously had a vision for Anzac Day, and if you got in his way, it wasn't good for you.
It steamrolled you.
Yeah, but I mean, he really made it happen. So Anzac Day. So later, it also served to commemorate the lives of Australians who died in the Second World War, and all subsequent military and peacekeeping operations in which Australia has been involved. And what's cool is that major anniversaries were marked by pilgrimages to Gallipoli by Anzac veterans. So on the 50th anniversary, 71 original Anzacs landed on the beaches.
On the 50th anniversary?
Yeah,
wow.
so 65.
Jesus.
They were ferried in on lifeboats, very similar to...
I mean, we've seen the ones actually at the War Memorial. We've got the original landing boat.
With the bullet holes.
With the bullet holes. Yeah. And they do look very similar to, say, a lifeboat, particularly one of the 60s era.
Yeah, that's right. Probably wouldn't have changed much. So they were brought there by cruise ship, then ferried in on these lifeboats. And they were greeted by Turkish veterans. Isn't that nice?
That is incredible. I think a bond, fair enough, between Turks and Australians, really established through this.
Yeah, and still exists very much today.
Yeah,
They're
indeed.
still very supportive of Anzac Day services taking place there.
Seeing the memorials and in Anzac Cove and its surrounds myself, there's deference to the Allied force. There's certainly deference to the Anzac graves and memorials as there are to anybody else.
There's Turkish cemeteries there and Allied cemeteries.
Indeed, Lone Pine Cemetery and all these others. It is quite remarkable.
And you were saying before, there's a museum, Turkish museum.
It is a Turkish museum, and of course it's a Turkish story.
That's interesting. It's interesting. So you would have wandered around the trenches, I guess.
Yes, and the trenches are still there.
Yeah.
Obviously, they've eroded. They're kind of half a metre deep, not multiple metres deep now, but you can still see them.
And you would have seen that very steep and forbidding terrain immediately behind.
Indeed, the Sphinx. Yeah. It's just like the model they have at the War Memorial.
So the Sphinx is a sort of mountainous feature.
It's a triangular kind of cliff face, effectively a protrusion out of the cliff face.
Because they were landed famously at the wrong place, weren't they?
It's like a mile off course, I believe.
So the idea was to land them a flatter sort of...
Indeed. There's no one in any right mind would land troops there to charge up a hill that's 45 degrees.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do that with rifles. It'd be hard enough just to do it with,
and they had packs. It wasn't just a rifle. They were laden down, and they were being shot at.
Would have been incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
I can't imagine they even managed to secure the top of the cliffs. Yeah. I mean, the only fortunate thing was that, of course, when they landed, of course, there was some defensive measures there, but it was still a bit of a surprise. It wasn't heavily fortified at the time, but of course, it didn't take long before the Turks did do that. Yeah. So,
it'd be really worthwhile going there.
I recommend any Australian or anyone to go and have a look. It is truly it's a haunting place, I think.
Yeah. However, from the 1960s to the 80s, the popularity of Anzac Day diminished, and this probably was associated with the Vietnam War and the antagonism towards that that many members of the Australian public felt. So they sort of went off war generally. And also quite a few people felt that Anzac Day was firmly in the grip of the RSL.
The reason they went off war, Conan, is probably because of conscription.
Yeah, well, that was definitely a factor. And there wasn't conscription for the First World War.
Indeed.
Yeah. Although, as you no doubt know, there were a couple of referendums, and there was very divisive within Australian society about whether or not to do that. And that's why Australian soldiers were never executed for desertion.
Is that right?
The Brits really wanted to, because quite a few. I'm not saying
because they were a volunteer.
Yeah, they were volunteers,
force.
So the Brits weren't allowed to shoot them on the Western Front. I'm not saying a lot of Australians.
Did the Brits shoot their own soldiers?
Yeah, absolutely. Set an example. So if you shot through, you could expect, if you were caught, to get
in World War One
to get executed. I'm not saying a lot of Australians. I'm not saying a disproportionate number of Australians ran away. I'm just saying that obviously there's always going to be a number of people, and I would have been among them, I suspect.
You and me both.
Yes. Yeah. So because people felt that it was sort of very much an RSL activity, a lot of people felt that the RSL was a bit out of touch. So for our legions of non-Australian listeners, the RSL is the Returned Services League, much like the British Legion in the UK. I do happen to know that we have at least 2 British listeners, Chris. I'm not...
Do we?
Yeah.
Oh my God, okay.
My parents-in-law, devoted listeners.
We appreciate your patronage.
So it was also seen as an excuse for many men to get drunk and play two-up, which was only legal, as we all know, is only legal on that day. And again, for, if you don't know what two-up is coins, gambling. So, it was quite raucous behaviour. People would get really, really smashed. And so that was seen as being an inappropriate way to behave on this solemn day. So since the 80s, however, commemorative activities on the Gallipoli Peninsula have become much more common. So there's significant uptake in enthusiasm for going there as a kind of pilgrimage.
It's a pilgrimage, isn't it? Absolutely,
so. Yeah, secular pilgrimage. Yeah, and in many ways not that secular. I don't know if you feel the same, but you certainly find that around the Anzac tradition and myth and, the rituals that this priest introduced into Anzac Day, there's it's as close to a religious ceremony as it could be without being actually religious.
I agree. For a secular nation like ours,
yeah.
I agree. It's the only thing I can think of in terms of that truly kind of a unifying but quasi-religious day.
Yeah, and if you go to and order the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, the War Memorial here in Canberra, the one in Sydney and elsewhere, they are temples or shrines. They even call themselves that. And I was at the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne the other day, just a couple of weeks ago, and I was thinking, this is like a Mayan temple. I'm sure it's very deliberately built, inspired by Mayan temples. Interesting how that's how we process it.
Yeah, I agree. And look, and these places are well worth visiting if you haven't been to Canberra or obviously.
Yeah, yes. So Turkey's becoming, and part of the reason for that is because Turkey is now easy to get to, of course, than it was before that. And particularly in 1990, to mark the 75th anniversary of the campaign, Prime Minister Bob Hawke went to Gallipoli on Anzac Day, and he was the first PM to do so. And he was accompanied by a group of, obviously very elderly Gallipoli veterans, and thousands of Australians attended and have done so ever since. If we haven't been there ourselves, we've seen video footage, photos of just the place crammed. Oh, and then 2007, Indigenous communities began organising Anzac Day marches to remember fallen First Nations people.
The forgotten members of the forces.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right, yeah. So that's all I have on this, I think pretty interesting topic.
Yeah, I think it is. And thanks for your research yet again. So what do we have for our next episode?
We're going to talk about the wreck of the Batavia, Chris.
Wonderful. Now,
your eyes are lighting up.
Is one of my favourite stories. I'm a
salty sea dog.
I think I'm a salty sea dog. I'm a sailor in a past life, and I think this story is one of the great stories of mutiny, of
mass slaughter.
Of mass slaughter. Well, anyway, one of the great Australian stories that I don't think.
Of Dutch people going crazy.
Unless you watch SBS on a Sunday night, you're probably not fully aware of. It's an amazing story.
So it's the Batavia was a Dutch East India vessel that wrecked off the western Australian coast in the early 17th century. Bad things happened as a result. Slight trigger warning. The story is a bit grim. It's an interesting parallel to Nazism, I've always thought. And if that sounds a bit weird and cryptic, wait till next episode and you'll see what the hell I'm talking about.
I look forward to it, Conan.
Excellent, Chris. Until next time, bye-bye.
It's goodbye from us.